Coming up, the future of the American military.
Because you don't want the Army to do one thing, right? I mean, you want the Army to do whatever you want the Army to do. So we need an Army that's capable of providing multiple options to the President, to our Secretary of Defense.
Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster discusses the technological, psychological, and ethical evolution of the U.S. Army. It's just ahead on Global Ethics Forum.
It's a pleasure and an honor to be given this opportunity to interview Lieutenant General McMaster. I first encountered him, like many others, I suppose, when I read his remarkable book based on his doctoral dissertation, Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson, Robert McNamara, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Lies That Led to Vietnam. He was then a major, and I heard him speak about the book in 1998 at the Army War College, where I had just joined the faculty. We've all followed his remarkable career in the intervening years as he worked out the counterinsurgency approach to Iraq when he commanded the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment in Tel Afar, long before the more noticed work on the counterinsurgency manual led by General Petraeus. Along one of the deep thinkers in the U.S. Army, he is now in the perfect position to help the Army through one of those major resets of the force, such as that happened after Vietnam, which is chronicled in another excellent book, James Kitfield's book, Prodigal Soldiers. First question. General McMaster, it seems to me that the kind of combat the U.S. Army has experienced in the past 12 plus years is of an especially morally corrosive sort. There is no behind-the-lines respite for many of our troops. In many cases, they carry high levels of unrelieved stress for long deployments of 10 or 12 months. And many, as you know, have had 2, 3, 4 of these deployments into Iraq and Afghanistan. Given that complexity of that environment, how can we best train, educate, and prepare them to maintain ethical and legal standards in that environment? And how do the well-publicized major ethical lapses we've seen in the Army in civil-military relations affect that and the mission?
I think that's a tremendous question because it really alludes to the kinds of wars we've been in over the last 13 to 14 years. And we've learned quite a bit, and we've relearned quite a bit as we've fought really brutal, murderous, in many ways unscrupulous enemies. And if you see what, for example, ISIL is doing today, if you understand really the various Taliban groups that we're fighting in Afghanistan and what they want to achieve, which is a denial of human rights, imposition on people of sort of this medieval, I would say, really irreligious idea of the kind of state and that they would like to impose. The brutality that they direct toward women, toward children, and really what they've done to really perpetuate conflict through the mass murder of innocents. You would think, okay, well, how do you deal with an enemy like this? An enemy that operates in this way and then is intermingled with civilian populations. Maybe to defeat this kind of an enemy, you have to be equally brutal. Maybe you have to lower your standards, but I would say that exactly the opposite is the case. We have to defeat them in a way that's consistent with our values, right? Our values that reflect our society and what's expected of our military, our Army, for our Army forces. And of course, what's been expected, since at least the time of St. Thomas Aquinas and St. Augustine, going back even further. And so what does that mean? It means that we have to fight them applying the principles of just war theory, right? Which means distinction. We distinguish between our enemies and civilian populations. And what our Army has done, and what our Marine Corps in particular has done over this period of 14 years, I think is astounding in terms of what our soldiers have done in close contact with the enemy. Every day in Afghanistan today, every day across the wars in Iraq, our soldiers and Marines place themselves at a higher level of risk to protect innocents. And I think that's something that's very important to understand about these kind of conflicts. Our soldiers are warriors, but our soldiers are also humanitarians. And so while we don't want a fair fight, I mean, American people don't want Americans to be in a fair fight with the enemy, right? Because a fair fight in war means barely winning, and barely winning in war is an ugly proposition. What that means is we have to develop our force so we're able to overwhelm our enemies in close combat, but we are able to do that in a way that we apply firepower with discipline and discrimination. So what have we learned? Well, we've taken a look at where there have been breakdowns. Where have there been breakdowns in the moral character of units? And why does that happen? It happens because, I mean, these are tough environments of, as I mentioned, uncertainty, complexity, and persistent danger. But I think it happens for really 4 fundamental reasons. One of those is ignorance. If soldiers are ignorant of our values and what's expected of them, that's a problem. And if soldiers are ignorant of the environment that they're going into. So we in our Army emphasize applied ethics education and the internalization of the warrior ethos, which we see ourselves as warriors and as humanitarians, and where we inculcate the values of loyalty, duty, and I would highlight in particular respect. Respect for others in a Kantian sort of way, right? To treat man as an ends, not as a means. Now, we don't talk to soldiers typically about Kant, but we make clear what our expectations are. Maybe John Stuart Mill is a little bit better, right, in terms of utilitarianism. And we make it clear to soldiers, if you treat civilian populations with anything but respect, you're working for your enemy. So it's really clear that it's really important that soldiers understand how we use violence and what justifies violence. And it's particularly important to have this kind of education because contrast that with what justifies violence in our society today, at least in popular media, in video games and in movies. And typically it's the demonstration of individual prowess or the advancement of individual interest, right? And so for our military, what justifies violence? Well, it's a lawful mission and it's fighting for each other. And so we have to make it clear what justifies violence. And it's fundamentally different from oftentimes what young citizen volunteers come into the Army thinking. So applied ethics education is important. Ignorance, though, can also be about the people among whom these wars are fought. And so it's important for us to train soldiers for combat against enemies, but also to understand the populations, the micro-history of these areas, the social, the religious dynamics. And so what we want to do in this education of soldiers is develop empathy. Have them develop empathy for the people among whom these wars are fought. So ignorance is one of the first causes of breakdown, and these are some of the things that we do to address that. The other is uncertainty. Okay, these are environments of uncertainty, right? I mean, essentially there are two ways to fight the U.S. Army, the U.S. military, right? Asymmetrically and stupid. So our enemies are going to avoid being detected, right? They're going to operate in and amongst civilian populations, and they're going to try to make contact with us and initiate actions on their own terms. So what we have to do is try to mitigate that by making war less uncertain, by effective reconnaissance, but by describing to soldiers the mission that they're going on so they understand the broad purpose of what they're doing, so they can connect the risks that they take and the sacrifices they make with the achievement of aims that are worthy of those risks and sacrifices. The other thing is to train under conditions of uncertainty. You know, make those training conditions like they are in combat. Build change, casualties, bad information into the training. The third, I think, is fear. You know, and of course, you could, you know, this is sort of a Kierkegaard type insight into you know, human nature, and that fear drives everything. But fear in combat is bad. It's bad because fear leads to inaction. Inaction in Army units and in any military unit can create opportunities for the enemy. So you don't want soldiers to experience fear. It can lead to bad decisions, right? If people are fearful, what if they're jumpy, right? They could seem out of control. They could fire weapons in ways that place people at unnecessary risk. So how do you build a bulwark against fear in units? And really, it's fundamentally confidence. It's confidence in their own training, confidence in their weapons, confidence in each other, confidence in their leaders. Understanding that they're going to be in dangerous situations, but understanding that they are with the right team that can cope with that. And so addressing fear is a cause of breakdown, and that's how we deal with that as well. And then finally, it's combat trauma. The most difficult things in combat are to see, you know, the results of brutal enemy attacks on civilian populations, but even the results of encounters with the enemy. The most difficult thing psychologically to cope with is the loss of one of your soldiers or Marines or sailors or airmen in your unit. It's very tough business because, you know, and a tough experience because in a military unit really grows together over time, you know, through shared hardships, through common commitments to each other, and Army platoons and companies and cavalry troops and artillery batteries, they become like a family. And so when you lose a fellow soldier, you lose a family member, really. So the key thing is to prepare soldiers and leaders, especially, to be able to deal with combat trauma. And that has to do with grief work, right? And understanding, you know, what are going to be the responses. In particular, you have to guard against rage becoming a combat motivator. And so what you have to do is explain to your soldiers there are only two motivations again, right, for combat, and that's the mission and your fellow soldiers. Rage is not an appropriate motivator in combat. And so helping soldiers grieve and then looking for warning signs, right? Everybody has a breaking point. All of us in this room have a breaking point. And all of us come, you know, in the Army, come to military service with different backgrounds and different strengths and frailties. And combat tends to magnify both your strengths and virtues and your frailties. And so leaders have to be, you know, parts psychiatrist and psychologist. They have to be parts social worker. They have to be attuned to their soldiers and look for those warning signs. And then, of course, a big part of that, which we've learned in these wars, is that we have to destigmatize seeking of help, right? You know, your mental state is just like your physical state, right? We emphasize physical readiness in our Army. We also have to recognize mental and psychological readiness. And so just getting like a physical checkup, you get a mental checkup, and your leaders are attuned to that. But I think that, you know, one of the key things is to recognize that war is profoundly human, and that the battles that we've had in Afghanistan and Iraq have more in common with them than there are differences between battles here in New York during the Revolutionary War. As the historian John Keegan said, what battles have in common is human. And it's the struggle of men and women, he wrote men at the time, but men and women struggling to reconcile their instinct for self-preservation with the achievement of some aim over which other men are trying to kill them. And so understanding that psychological dynamic and how it applies to these complex wars is important.
In the 1990s, there was a lot of talk in the U.S. military as it looked at the remarkable performance of the force in the first Gulf War. People were arguing that we were now experiencing what was commonly called a revolution in military affairs, that our forces would be so technologically superior that we could look forward for the indefinite future to what we were calling full spectrum dominance against any foreseeable adversary. What in that promise was right, and where did it go wrong?
Yeah. Well, I think that what was right was these are tremendous capabilities, right? That we want to have a technological differential advantage in technology over our adversaries, but what was wrong with it is it neglected continuities in the nature of war, you know, and it took a technological approach to the very complex human and political and you know, problem of war, and didn't recognize war as a contest of wills, you know, and didn't give much agency to the enemy. And what Sir Michael Howard has pointed out is that wars resemble each other more than they resemble any other human activity. So you always have to be suspicious about analogies that are made, analogies that were made to war. And so these concepts, and it was hard to be against them, right? I mean, the names were like rapid decisive operations. So if you're not for that, what are you for? Are you for ponderous indecisive operations? I mean, and these things tended to brief well. I mean, they look good on PowerPoint, you know. And so the continuities in war that they neglected was that war is an extension of politics, right? These concepts of the revolution in military affairs, full spectrum dominance, you know, dominant battle space knowledge, rapid decisive operations, and so forth, really looked at war as a big targeting exercise. And essentially, we could win wars by the application of firepower onto land from the air and maritime domains. This approach to war is kind of like I would call it the George Costanza approach to war, right? You leave on a high note. But of course, you know, the war still goes on because it's fundamentally a political competition, typically for power, resources, and survival among human beings who happen to like live on land. These were hubristic ideas because they didn't give much agency to the enemy. They neglected war as political. They neglected the human dimension of war, right? Why people fight. People fight, I think, fundamentally for the same reasons that Thucydides identified 2,500 years ago: fear, honor, and interest. And so if you don't understand the causes of violence, if you're not acting really to affect what is driving the violence, you're just treating symptoms. So while these wars promised, you know, the leave on a high note, right, decisive, everything was, you know, in and out, well, the enemy has a say in that. And I think because of this simplistic, really, definition of war, that we didn't fully consider what was necessary to consolidate military gains in the wake of the very successful military operations in Afghanistan between September and December of 2001 and in Iraq in 2003. And so we weren't prepared for what came after. And so I think the revolution in military affairs is dangerous. this idea, this thinking, but it's back. I mean, it's like a vampire. I mean, you can't kill it. It keeps coming back. And today there's sort of a new permutation of this, you know, and it's couched in different terms and so forth, but it's still based on the assumption that you can solve the complex problem of future armed conflict just by the application of advanced technologies. And in so doing, you'll be able to succeed very quickly. The RMA really highlights really the danger of this kind of hubristic thinking about America or any nation, Western nations, being able to achieve a differential advantage over all potential adversaries solely through technological advantages. Now, it doesn't mean you don't want technological advantages, right? As I mentioned, you don't want a fair fight. A fair fight in war is an ugly proposition. So these are important capabilities, but what happens is people become so enamored with these capabilities that then they begin to masquerade as strategies and answers to the complex problem of future armed conflict.
This is a question, I guess, about your current job, about thinking about the future of the Army. When General Shinseki was Chief of Staff of the Army, 99
Right.
to 2003 or something like that, he argued that the Army really needed to transform itself, long before Rumsfeld's talk about transformation. And in particular, he thought that the force had to mostly be based in the United States and be rapidly deployable, and therefore it had to be light. What about that vision of 10 years ago do you think will inform your thinking about the future Army?
Well, I think what General Shinseki put in place here, this medium weight force, is still quite relevant. So what we have is tremendous opportunity these days to, I think, follow up on General Shinseki's vision by the application of new technologies. And so I'm not a Luddite. You know, I believe in the application of new technologies to military capabilities. And these are power and energy technologies that will help us reduce logistics demand. And that will allow us to deploy force, because it's not like the tank's heavy. It's everything has to support the tank, and then the size of the formation, right? So anywhere you want to go in the world with an armored brigade combat team, I mean, it's 2 boats for a brigade combat team, you know. No matter how heavy the vehicles are, it's 2 boats. And you think, you know, a tank, yeah, it's really heavy, but it's really all about ground pressure and mobility. And so those tanks can go places where, you know, a Humvee, you know, or a wheeled vehicle can't go. So it's important to really understand what you're trying to achieve. And what we want to do is reduce logistics demand and the weight and size of the formations. To do what? Well, what we want to be able to do is conduct what we call in our new Army operating concept, and you can look it up online, it's a real page turner. We need to conduct joint combined arms operations. And that's the deployment of task organized, tailorable, scalable forces with combined arms capabilities. Combined arms for us, what does that mean? That means infantry, mobile protected firepower, kind of like tanks and armored vehicles, engineers, aviation, fires, and joint capabilities. Because, you know, that kind of joint combined arms operation allows you to gain that differential advantage over the enemy. There's not one thing that gives you an advantage in combat. It's how you combine things. Combat's rock, paper, scissors. That's really what it is. That's what combined arms operation is. So you show up with a rock, the enemy has paper, but your scissors are already right there, and they're ready to go. And you're then seizing, retaining, exploiting the initiative over that enemy. Now the problem is, you know, it's a period of diminished resources, right? And some people are saying, okay, hey, what we just need to do now is innovate. Just sprinkle some innovation on the Army and it'll be fine. Well, actually, we do need that. We do need to become more agile and innovative, but we also need resources, right, to be able to maintain that differential advantage. So what are we innovating for in our Army today? In our part of the Army where we develop future force capabilities, we're innovating for a purpose, and that's to deliver the maximum combat capability, ability to accomplish the mission to the force in the shortest amount of time with the resources available. And so we do need to become more agile as an institution to do that. General Odierno today is really leading an effort to transform how our Army does things, how our Army learns and thinks about future war. And I think this could be really, you know, a big change for the better for our nation and for our Army. So the key about thinking about future war is to understand the questions you're asking. Sir Michael Howard said, right, no matter how hard you think about future war, you're not going to be exactly right, right? The key is to not be so far off the mark that you can't adjust once the real demands of a conflict reveal themselves to you. So, well, one of the ways to make sure you're not too far off the mark is just make sure you're asking the right questions. So what we've identified are 20 first-order questions, the answers to which will improve current and future force combat effectiveness. These are things that armies have always had to do, will have to do in the future. How do we develop and sustain a high degree of situational understanding in complex environments and against adaptive enemies. I mean, that's going to be a problem for a long time. But we can work on that and figure out how we can do that better. How do we develop resilient soldiers and cohesive teams who are capable of conducting operations consistent with our professional ethic in environments of complexity, uncertainty, and persistent danger? That's one of our questions. And so we're working on these questions, and we have a campaign of learning called Force 2025 Maneuvers, because you need a catchy phrase, right, for everything. So Force 2025 Maneuvers is our campaign of learning, and that's seminars, it's engagement with academia, it's experimentation, it's wargaming, it's our operations we're on today, it's what we're learning from other armies and what's happening around the world. That's our campaign of learning. And then we take what we learn and apply that to future force development, right? You don't want the Army to do one thing, right? I mean, you want the Army to do whatever you want the Army to do. So we need an Army that's capable of providing multiple options to the President, to our Secretary of Defense. And so that's the kind of Army we're developing.
You know, there have been some pretty glaring historical examples of people in your position who got it spectacularly wrong. The French General Staff thought the best spent defense dollar for them between the wars was the Maginot Line, and the Germans just drove around it, right? So, you know, the quote that Joel cited from Rumsfeld, you know, you go to the Army, to the war with the Army you got, not with the Army you might wish to have or might be, in theory, relevant to the environment where you find yourself, has this challenge. You've got to have a reasonably good crystal ball. And that all depends on what you think the next 15 or 20 years of major uses of military force will be around the world. So what is your vision of that?
Right. Well, I mean, the key thing to understand is, as you're saying, we've never been right. I mean, so I think the first thing is humility, or just recognize you're not going to have it right. I mean, who would have predicted really what Putin and what Russia is doing to reassert its power on the Eurasian landmass right now? I mean, nobody really predicted that was going to happen. Who several years ago saw this tremendous catastrophe, you know, in the greater Middle East, and the descent of Syria into chaos, the bleed over into Iraq, and, you know, what threatens to be a regional sectarian, you know, fitna, or, you know, civil war that would be a disaster for all the people in the region. I mean, these things, you might see glimpses of these things, but you can't really see it clearly. So how do you deal with that? I think you have to try to make a grounded projection into the future, right? So the Greeks said the way you think about the way to consider the future is to walk backward into it, right? Looking at the past, looking at what's going on today, and make that grounded projection. I think when we got in trouble is when we would think about like leap ahead, you know, capabilities, right? And in fact, some of the most hubristic language in the 1990s was that we were to develop such tremendous capability, you know, technological overmatch over the enemy, that we will lock out our enemies out of the market of future war. Wouldn't even be a possibility. And so the problem with that is it ignores, again, you know, the enemy has a say in it. And so you interact with enemies in wars to be able to adapt to really these unforeseen challenges, but you also interact with potential adversaries in between wars, right? I think when you think about threats and enemies, you have to think about them doing four things. They try to evade your capabilities, they're trying to avoid being classified as a target, right? The second thing is they'll try to disrupt your capabilities, and these are these countermeasures, right? Submarine, sonar, bomber, radar, machine gun, tank, anti-tank missile, right? This interaction. And just, you know, there'll be a countermeasure of some kind. They'll try to emulate your capabilities. I mean, as we know, I mean, China has been engaged in the largest theft of intellectual property in history. I mean, there's a reason why the new Chinese fighter looks like an F-22, you know. I mean, and so I think you could argue that technology is the most transferable advantage that we have in defense to our adversaries, right? So what we're saying is, well, it's not just about technology, it's about really how we combine technologies. And for the U.S. Army in particular, right? An Army is different, right? I mean, the Army operates on land. Land warfare is different, right? I mean, you can't wage war in air or space or at sea without a vehicle, unless you can really swim super far. I mean, so on land, you're able to wage war with a club. You know what I mean? I mean, that's where people live. And so the penetration of technology into land warfare is not as great as it is in the more fluid, you know, media of the maritime, airspace, and cyber domains as well. And so I think we have to recognize this, you know, the environments we're in and the limitations of the technology, and that enemies enemies will be able to emulate these capabilities. And finally, what we see is our enemies expand. They expand onto other battlegrounds and contested spaces, right? You know, what some analysts have called like the space between, military operations and peace and stability. And these are battlegrounds of information and perception. We see, I mean, ISIL is very good at this. The Russians are really good at this. Just watch RT. Have you ever seen RT on cable? I mean, it's very sophisticated Russian propaganda aimed at our society and Western society. If you look at the Iranians and their Arabic media is very slick, very sophisticated. Look at what ISIL's doing on social media. So, I mean, I think that we have to be able to, those are contested spaces, right? Sometimes when we view those other contested spaces, political subversion, the battlegrounds of violent criminality, organized crime, we tend to look at these and think that, well, we ought to be maybe just neutral in that contested space. But no, we have to compete effectively across all these battlegrounds. So I think that we can't leap ahead, I don't think. I think leap ahead capabilities in defense are a pipe dream. I think we have to think way ahead. We have to try to anticipate these differential advantages that we can achieve with investment, like global positioning system technology. We've had some tremendous breakthroughs, stealth technologies. We don't want to not do that. It's very important. We have to recognize that we ought to evolve and modernize our force based on a grounded projection into the future.
All right. Well, we are dismissed. Thank you very much for coming.
For more on this program and other Carnegie Ethics Studio productions, visit carnegiecouncil.org. There you can find video highlights, transcripts, audio recordings, and other multimedia resources on global ethics. This program is made possible by the Carnegie Ethics Studio and viewers like you.